A pregnant woman collapsed in the snow, whispering one name she was terrified of, and one truth she couldn't escape. Miles away from anyone who could help her, a former Navy SEAL almost drove past, until his dog refused to move. That single moment would pull him into a story of lies, control, and a man who looked trustworthy to everyone else. Because in a quiet northern town, danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles and calls itself protection. What they discovered wasn't just about saving a life. It was about stopping someone from taking a child before she was even born. And before this night ends, one choice will decide whether a mother keeps her future or loses everything. Tell me where you're watching from. Share how this story makes you feel. And don't forget to like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep telling stories like this. In the northern edge of Minnesota, winter did not always come like darkness. In Silver Ridge, winter came like judgment made beautiful. Snow lay over the pine forests, the rooftops, the long stone shoulders around the lake, glazing everything in a pale brilliance that could make a man squint even at noon. The light there was strange in the cold months. It did not warm. It only revealed. It showed every fence post, every frozen rut in the road, every chimney breathing smoke into the white sky. It showed how small a human life really was against miles of forest and frozen water. And for the people who stayed through January and February, that kind of light taught honesty. You respected the weather, or the weather humbled you. Callan Mercer had learned long ago to respect anything that could kill quietly. At 37, he still moved like a man whose body remembered command before thought. He stood about 6 feet tall, lean and compact, built for endurance rather than display, with the functional strength of someone who had spent years carrying weight because there had been no one else to carry it. His face was clean-shaven, the lack of beard making the hard lines of his square jaw and defined cheekbones even more visible. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than regulation had once allowed, and the cold northern wind had weathered his fair skin into something rougher, touched with pale red across the nose and cheeks. His eyes were gray-blue, the kind of eyes that could look distant even when focused directly on a thing. Callen lived alone in a timber cabin near the eastern edge of Lake Belmere, where the plowed road gave up its small claim to civilization and let the woods begin again. He made a living with his hands now. He repaired farm equipment, cleared fallen timber, fixed pipes in lakeside rentals, and drove wherever the weather allowed if somebody in town needed a job done right the first time. People in Silver Ridge respected him. They spoke well of him in that reserved northern way that did not pry too hard. He paid his bills, kept his word, and never talked more than necessary. That was enough. Before this life, he had been a Navy SEAL. He rarely said the words aloud. The town knew, because towns always knew, but Callen did not offer stories from that life, and no decent person asked. War had a way of surviving in the men who came back from it. In Callen, it lived in the way he checked mirrors without seeming to, in the way he sat facing doors in public places, in the way silence never made him uncomfortable. He had built a disciplined life because discipline was cleaner than memory. The one living creature allowed fully inside that discipline was Vargo. Vargo, a 4 to 5-year-old German Shepherd with a yellow-black coat and a powerful working-line build, occupied the passenger seat of Callen's old truck like a second intelligence. He was large without heaviness, muscular without clumsiness, with upright ears, an alert brow, and amber-brown eyes that seemed to study the world rather than merely look at it. A worn brown leather collar rested against the thick fur of his neck. There was a faint pale scar near one ear, almost hidden unless the light struck it right. Vargo was not a restless dog. He did not fidget, bark for attention, or wag his body at every passing soul. He watched, listened, and made his judgments carefully. When he acted, Callen paid attention. That afternoon, the truck was carrying a crate of metal fittings and a replacement hydraulic hose from the north side of the lake. The road home curved between tall pines burdened with snow, then dipped into a stretch of service road used mostly by utility crews and stubborn locals who believed bad weather was a problem for lesser people. The sun had begun lowering into a white-gold haze, bright enough to flash across the windshield in hard, clean bursts. Callen drove with both gloved hands steady on the wheel. The truck heater rattled, the old tires hummed over packed snow. Vargo sat beside him in grave silence, head high. Then the dog changed. His ears snapped forward. A low sound moved through his throat. Not quite a growl, not quite a warning bark. One front paw struck the floorboard once, sharply. Callen glanced at him. "What is it?" There was no answer in the human sense, of course, but Vargo's whole body had gone intent, not anxious, not excited. Intent. Callen lifted his foot from the gas. Outside, the road looked empty. Snowbanks, pine trunks, blue-white glare. No wrecked vehicle, no waving figure, no movement except a powder of loose snow slipping from a low branch. Vargo let out a harder sound and pressed toward the passenger-side window. That was enough. Callen slowed the truck and pulled to the shoulder. The moment the engine dropped into idle, Vargo was already shifting, nails scraping the floor mat. Callen opened his door, boots sinking deep into the crusted snow, and came around just in time to unclip the dog. Vargo leapt down and went straight toward the shallow ditch beyond the road. The air hit hard and clean, sharp with pine resin and ice. Callen followed quickly, his old military work boots biting into the packed edge of the bank. One glance at the tracks ahead told him something was wrong. There had been a vehicle here recently. The snow near the shoulder was disturbed, muddied in a way that did not match the road surface. Then he saw another set of marks, staggered, dragging, human. "Vargo," he said, lower now. The dog was standing at the edge of the ditch, rigid. At first Callen thought it was a bundle of discarded clothing half buried in drifted snow. Then the bundle moved. A woman lay on her side in the powder-white bank, one hand curled toward her abdomen as if trying to shield life with the last of her strength. She looked young, late 20s perhaps, with chestnut-brown hair half loose from a tie at the nape of her neck. Her face was pale beneath the cold, fine-boned and drawn with exhaustion, the oval shape of it made sharper by dehydration and fear. Her mouth was dry and slightly split. One cheek bore the fading yellow edge of an older bruise. Her long parka, blue-gray with frost at the hem, was torn at one cuff. Beneath it, the curve of late pregnancy was unmistakable. This was no woman who had simply slipped on an icy road. Her boots were practical winter boots, dark brown and scuffed, now crusted with a mixture of snow, mud, and road salt. Her knees were wet through. Her fingers, bare of gloves, had gone red-violet from the cold. Callen dropped immediately into a crouch. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Vargo lowered himself beside her, not touching at first, only releasing warm breath into the air above her shoulder. Something in the dog's posture shifted then, protective, deliberate, as if he had recognized vulnerability and filed it under his care. The woman opened her eyes just enough to look at Callen. They were hazel, though dulled now by shock and pain. Still, there was intelligence in them, Fear, too. Not the blind fear of someone lost in weather, the more focused kind, the kind directed at a particular person. Callan slid one arm carefully beneath her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, adjusting when he felt the weight and shape of her pregnancy. She made a faint sound, more from effort than pain, and her hand clutched weakly at his sleeve. "Don't," she whispered. "You're freezing. I've got you." Her lips moved again. This time the words came torn apart by cold and fatigue. "Don't call, Gavin. Don't let him take the baby." The sentence went through him like an iron nail. He had heard many things from injured people, pleas, confessions, prayers, sometimes nonsense. But desperation had a tone that could not be faked, and that tone lived in her voice now. He stood with her in his arms and headed back toward the truck. Vargo stayed pressed close against his leg, head turning once toward the line of trees across the road. At the driver's side door, Callan paused just long enough to search the woman's coat pockets with the efficient guilt of necessity. He found a folded prenatal clinic file, damp at the edges, a small amount of cash, and a tiny brass key tied with red thread. No phone, no full wallet, no emergency kit, no signs of a planned trip. Whoever she was, whatever had put her on that roadside, she had not reached this place safely. He settled her in the back seat first, then changed his mind and moved her carefully to the front passenger side so the heater would hit more directly. Vargo climbed in at once and curled his body along her legs and side, sharing heat without crowding her. The woman's head fell back against the seat, and for a moment she looked heartbreakingly young. Callan shut the door and stood in the bright cold, looking down the road. The nearest county hospital was over the ridge road west of the lake. On a clean day, it was manageable. On a day like this, with the weather report warning of worsening wind, drifting snow, and timed closure along the pass, it could turn from a drive into a gamble fast. Hypothermia made fools of good intentions. If the woman lost more body heat before he reached proper care, she and the baby could both be in trouble. He made the decision in less than 3 seconds. Temporary shelter, heat, fluids, immediate medical assessment from the closest qualified person he trusted. He got back in the truck, turned the heater higher, and reached for his phone. Elen Shaw answered on the 3rd ring. Elen was 35, a family physician and nurse practitioner at the community clinic in Silver Ridge. A woman with a lean, capable frame, medium brown hair, usually tied low, and gray-green eyes that missed very little. She dressed plainly, spoke directly, and had the kind of calm competence that made frightened people obey instructions before realizing they had done so. She and Callan were not close in any sentimental way, but they shared an older kind of trust, the kind built when two people had seen each other in hard circumstances and neither had performed for the other. "Mercer?" she said. "Something's wrong." He glanced at the woman beside him. "Found a pregnant female in a roadside ditch. Late 20s, maybe. Hypothermia risk, exhaustion, possible assault indicators, conscious in flashes. I'm taking her to the cabin because the ridge road may close before I can get west." A beat of silence. Then Elen's voice sharpened into motion. "You did right. Start warming slowly, not aggressively. No scalding heat. Keep her awake if you can. I'll come to you." He ended the call and drove. The truck moved through long bands of white light and blue shadow. The woods thinned, then gathered again. Once, about 10 minutes into the drive, the woman stirred and made a small broken sound. Vargo lifted his head instantly and nudged her sleeve with his nose. She did not wake fully, but her breathing steadied. At the halfway mark, the strange moment came. the one that would remain with Callan long after the rest of the evening broke open. Vargo, who had been focused entirely on the woman, suddenly raised his head and stared not at the road ahead, but at the rear window. He did not bark. He simply watched with such intense stillness that Callan felt the old instincts in his spine come alive. Callan checked the mirror. For a second he saw nothing but the white road and the reflected fire of winter sun. Then, far behind, just at the curve where the pines crowded closer, something dark moved between the trees. Not a deer, not the wind, too deliberate for both. When he looked again, it was gone. Maybe a vehicle had paused beyond sight, maybe a person, maybe nothing more than memory using the landscape as a screen. But Callan had learned not to dismiss the body when it recognized danger before the mind could name it. He drove the rest of the way home faster. The cabin sat at the tree line above the eastern shore of the lake, modest and dark-timbered, with smoke lifting from the metal chimney and the porch half buried at its edges in old snow. It was the sort of place built by a practical man for useful weather. Inside, wool blankets, split firewood, iron stove, scarred table, tools on pegs, everything in order. Not cozy by intention, but warm by habit. Callan carried the woman inside and laid her near the stove on the long couch, layering blankets over and beneath her. In better light, he saw more of her clearly. She was about Naomi's age. No, he corrected himself, he did not yet know her name. But she had the look of someone who had once been lively and had been forced into vigilance so long that it now sat on her face, even unconscious. She was not fragile. She was depleted. Vargo took up position beside the couch like a sentry assigned by heaven itself. Callan filled a kettle, fetched towels, checked her pulse again, and watched the frost melt slowly from the ends of her hair. Outside, the light drained from the sky, leaving the pines blue-black and the snow luminous. When Elen's truck finally pulled into the drive, dusk had settled. Callan opened the door before she knocked. Elen came in carrying a medical bag, cheeks red from the cold, parka dusted with fine snow. She took in the room, the woman on the couch, the dog beside her, and the look on Callan's face. "You said possible assault indicators," she said quietly. "I said what I had." Elen knelt at once beside the couch. "Let's see who she is." The woman's eyes fluttered again. Her lips moved. This time the word that escaped them was clear enough to hear. Naomi. So now she had a name. Naomi Reed lay unconscious by the fire while Elen began her work, and the first true dark gathered beyond the windows. On the porch, when Callan stepped out once more to breathe and think, Vargo followed only long enough to look past him toward the distant road. The dog stood there in the cold, yellow-black coat, touched silver by moonlight, ears forward, body still. Whatever had happened on that white road had not ended there, and Callan Mercer, who had meant only to save one life for one night, understood with a quiet heaviness that the cold had brought something to his door that would not leave his life unchanged. Elen Shaw arrived just after dusk, when the last clean light had drained from the snow and the woods around the cabin had gone blue and nearly black. Her truck came up the narrow drive with steady caution, tires crunching through the packed white ruts Callan had cut earlier that week. When she stepped out, the cold took her breath in a sharp, visible cloud, but she moved through it without fuss. Elen was 35, lean and capable, with the kind of body built by long hours on her feet and winters that did not care whether a woman was tired. Her medium brown hair was tied low at the nape of her neck, practical and slightly wind-loosened now, and her face, fine-boned, intelligent, and calm, carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years making frightened people listen, before panic ruined them. Her light skin had been pinked by the cold. Her gray-green eyes were observant without being intrusive. She dressed the way people did when their lives were useful instead of decorative. A dark olive winter medical parka, sturdy boots, dark jeans, and a canvas bag that held more competence than most people carried in their whole personalities. Callan met her at the door before she could knock. "She's in here," he said. Elen gave him one quick look, enough to read the tension around his mouth and the deeper one beneath it. "Still in and out?" She drifted twice, said one name, Gavin. "That the husband?" "Didn't sound like a husband." Elen did not waste time answering that. She stepped inside, and the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and thawing cold wrapped around her at once. Naomi lay on the couch near the stove beneath two heavy blankets, one hand half curled over the rise of her abdomen even in sleep. The heat had brought color back into her face, but only a little. She was still too pale, her lips too dry, her breathing too uneven at the edges. In the softer light of the cabin, she looked younger and more exhausted than she had on the roadside. Her chestnut-brown hair, loose from its tie, spread over the blanket in damp, tangled strands. There was a bruised, yellowing mark near one cheekbone, and the cuff of her parka had been frayed hard enough to suggest fingers, not weather. Vargo lay on the floor beside her, head lifted the moment Elen approached. The shepherd did not bark. He only watched. "Still the same watchdog," Elen murmured. Vargo's amber-brown eyes remained on her. She crouched slowly and let him scent the back of her hand. Only then did he lower his head again, though not fully. Approval, not trust. That was how Vargo worked. Elen set her bag on the table and began. Blood pressure, temperature, pupil response, pulse, gentle questions, even when Naomi did not fully answer. The movements were clean, efficient, and respectful. She listened for the baby next, and when the heartbeat came through, quick and strong and alive, something in the room loosened by half an inch. "The baby's holding on," Elen said quietly. Callen, standing at the stove with one hand braced against the mantel, let out a breath he had likely been keeping since the road. "And Naomi?" he asked. Elen glanced up at him. "Cold exposure, dehydration, stress overload, likely undernourished for at least a day or two. She needs warmth, fluids, rest, food in small amounts, and she needs not to be terrified every time she wakes up." Elen paused, studying Naomi's face again. "She also needs proper prenatal follow-up by morning." "She said not to call anyone." Elen's mouth flattened slightly. "That's not the same as saying no one should help her." Callan nodded once. Naomi stirred while Elen was wrapping the blood pressure cuff away. Her eyelashes fluttered, then her whole body tightened at once with the instinctive dread of someone waking in unfamiliar territory. Her eyes opened. For 1 second, confusion lived there. Then fear replaced it so fast it was like watching a shadow cross water. She tried to sit up. Pain caught her low and hard. Her hand flew to her stomach. Her breath went ragged. "No, no, no," she whispered, trying again anyway, the panic in her voice bigger than the words. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Elen said, and it was exactly the sort of sentence frightened people never believed at first. Naomi recoiled from it as if safety itself had betrayed her before. She shoved at the blanket, tried to swing her legs down, and nearly pitched herself off the couch. Then Vargo stood. He did not jump at her. He did not bark. He simply rose from the floor, walked the 2 careful steps forward, and placed his head against her knee. The effect was immediate and strange. Naomi froze. The dog's ears were relaxed, his breathing slow, his heavy body steady in the firelight. He offered no demand, no cleverness, no persuasion, only presence, the kind that did not tighten around a person, the kind that made room. Naomi's fingers, trembling badly, touched the fur behind his ear. Her next breath came deeper, then another. Elen glanced once at Callan, and he saw the same thing he felt. Whatever damage Naomi had been living inside, it had taught her to distrust voices faster than touch. "My name is Elen Shaw," Elen said after a moment, keeping her tone low and matter-of-fact. "I'm a family physician at the clinic in town. She tipped her head toward Callan, found you half-frozen in a roadside ditch and brought you here because the ridge road was already turning risky. No one's forcing anything tonight. But I need you calm enough to answer a few questions." Naomi looked from Elen to Callan. Callan stood exactly where he was, broad-shouldered in his old olive-gray tactical shirt, the worn cuffs pushed halfway up his forearms, his old military watch catching the firelight when he moved. He was a striking man without vanity, square jaw, dark short military hair, weathered light skin, gray-blue eyes that seemed hard until a person noticed how carefully he kept himself from frightening anybody. He had spent so long controlling his face that stillness had become his native language. "I found your prenatal file," he said. "You also had cash and a brass key, no phone." At the mention of the key, Naomi's eyes sharpened, not with relief, with calculation. "So you looked through my pockets," she said, "to keep you alive." A flicker passed over her face then, something that might have been shame or gratitude, or simply the exhausted realization that she no longer had the strength to resent practical things. "My name is Naomi Reed," she said after a beat. "I'm 29. "You know how far along you are?" Elen asked. 32 weeks, almost 33. "Any bleeding?" "No." "Any fall directly onto the abdomen?" "I don't think so. My knees, my side." Elen continued gently, methodically. Naomi answered in fragments at first, then with more steadiness as water, heat, and the simple structure of medical questions pulled her back into herself. Callan listened without interrupting. He had learned that some truths came easier when a man kept his silence from crowding them. Naomi had worked at Northvale Horizons doing bookkeeping support, cross-checking filings, fixing discrepancies before they became visible to people above her pay grade. Gavin Holt had come into her life through that world, an investor with interests near the lake, articulate, polished, and attentive in the beginning. He had known what flowers to send without seeming theatrical, what meals to order without asking enough questions to sound controlling. He had made concern look like devotion. Naomi had lost her mother the year before. Grief had left her raw in the places where good judgment usually sat. "I thought he was safe," she said, and the sentence seemed to embarrass her more than any confession ought to have. "That's the stupid part." "No," Elen said. "That's the human part." Naomi's mouth trembled once. "You didn't know him." "Maybe not," Elen replied, "but I know how men like that work." Silence followed, warm and brittle. Then Naomi began to tell the rest. Gavin did not scream. He did not strike walls. He did not come home reeking of whiskey or announce himself as a villain so obvious that even loneliness could not excuse staying. He operated by adjustment, suggestion, doubt. He corrected Naomi's memory in small ways first, told her she was overtired, too emotional, misremembering conversations. Once she was pregnant, Every feeling she had became something he could classify as instability, a concern, a symptom, a reason she should let him handle more. "He kept saying I needed less stress," Naomi whispered. "Then he became the source of it, and told me the stress proved I couldn't think clearly." Elen sat back a little, not surprised, only angry in the quiet professional way of someone who had seen cruelty dressed as care before. "And the records?" Callan asked. Naomi looked at him for the first time without flinching. Northvale had files that didn't make sense. Property reviews, authorizations, elderly owners signing things during medical transitions. Numbers shifted just enough to disappear if you weren't comparing versions side by side. Gavin wasn't the whole company, but he was inside it, deep enough. "Did you confront him?" "No, I asked the wrong question out loud." A bitter, humorless breath escaped her. "He didn't need more than that." Outside, wind moved against the cabin wall with a low brushing sound. Inside, the fire snapped once. Then came the moment that changed the room. Naomi had gone quiet, staring into the flames as if afraid of what remained to say. Vargo, who had not moved far from her side, suddenly rose and crossed to the chair where Callen had set her parka. He nosed at one pocket, then another, then took the cuff gently in his mouth and pulled the sleeve toward Naomi before releasing it. All three humans looked at him. "What is it?" Elen asked softly, as if the dog might answer in English out of respect for the mood. Naomi stared at the parka. Her face lost color again, though for an entirely different reason. "There's something in the lining," she said. Callan brought the coat over. Under Naomi's direction, he turned back the inside seam at the cuff, where the stitching had already partly loosened. Hidden there, folded down to almost nothing, was a thin square of paper wrapped in clear plastic. Naomi's fingers shook as she opened it. Inside was an ultrasound photo. For a few seconds, she just looked at it. Her throat worked once, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone smaller than before. "He found the nursery catalog on my laptop," she said. "He laughed and said I was planning too early." Her thumb moved over the blurred image as if she were trying to touch the child through time. "I started hiding things after that. Not because I had proof yet, because I knew I was getting afraid of him in a way that wasn't normal." No one spoke. There are some silences that feel empty. This one was not. This one felt like witness. Naomi pressed the ultrasound to her chest for only a moment before folding it carefully again. When she looked up, tears had gathered but not fallen. "He wanted me evaluated," she said, "psychologically. Not because I asked, because he said pregnancy was making me unstable. He was already building something. Paper, notes, a version of me he could hand to other people." "What other people?" Callan asked. "Doctors, lawyers, anyone who'd rather believe a calm man in a wool coat than a pregnant woman who looks tired." The truth of that settled heavily in the cabin. Elen gave Naomi more water. Callan ladled broth into a mug and set it within reach. Vargo returned to the floor beside the couch, one paw stretched out until it rested lightly against the hem of Naomi's blanket, as if he had decided proximity itself was now part of the treatment plan. Bit by bit, Naomi told them about leaving. She had not fled in drama. She had prepared in fear. A little cash, her prenatal paperwork, the hidden ultrasound, the brass key. She had waited until Gavin thought she had taken the sleep aid he insisted she needed. Then she had slipped out, taken her own car, and made it as far as the service road before realizing someone was following. Not Gavin himself, she thought. Someone else. She ditched the car where the trees narrowed, tried to cut across on foot, and then the cold began taking things from her one by one. Heat, balance, reason, distance. "I thought if I could just make it to the county road, I could flag someone down," she said. "You almost froze first," Elen said bluntly. Naomi nodded. She did not argue. Later, when Elen had finished her checks, and Naomi was finally drowsing instead of collapsing, the cabin quieted into the sort of stillness only winter houses know. Fire, wind, the faint settling of old wood. Elen stood at the counter washing her hands in Callan's enamel sink. "She'll need to come to the clinic tomorrow," she said. "Early, quietly. I can examine her properly there." "You trust your staff?" Callan asked. Elen dried her hands. "Most of them, but trust and caution are not the same thing." He looked toward Naomi. "What aren't you saying?" Elen asked. Callan hesitated only a second. "She said his name on the road, Gavin, and when I brought her in, there were no signs she got out where she intended to. That means someone pushed the timeline, maybe literally." Elen's gaze hardened. "You think he knows she ran? I think men like that notice missing obedience before they notice missing people." She took that in grimly. At the door, before she left, Elen rested one gloved hand briefly on the frame and looked back at him. "Don't make yourself into a fortress just because it's what you're good at. If this is what I think it is, she'll need more than one man and one dog." Callan gave the faintest nod. "Tonight, one man and one dog are what she has." Elen's expression softened for half a second. "Then make tonight hold." After her tail lights disappeared down the drive, Callan checked the locks, banked the stove, and stood for a long moment in the dim light beside the window. Inside, Naomi slept at last, one hand over her unborn child, Vargo curled below her like an old guardian carved out of fur and patience. Callan stepped outside to check the generator before turning in. The cold met him instantly. The sky had gone hard and clear. Stars caught sharp over the tree line. Snowlight made the yard look almost blue. He moved around the side of the cabin, breath smoking, boots sounding dull against the crusted ground. At the end of the narrow lane that curved toward the road, he stopped. There, faint but unmistakable in the new powder that had fallen since dusk, were tire marks. Fresh. Not close enough to the cabin to suggest a direct approach. Not deep enough to show someone had parked long. But recent. Careful. Watching from just far enough away to remain uninvited and remembered only by a man trained to notice what did not belong. Callan stood still, looking at them. Behind him, the cabin glowed warm and gold through the dark. Ahead of him, the white road held the shape of someone else's attention. Naomi Reed was no longer invisible, and whatever had hunted her to that roadside had now found the edge of his world. Morning came clear and merciless over Silver Ridge. The storm had passed in the night without fully arriving, leaving behind only a dusting of new snow over the old drifts and a sky so pale and bright it seemed polished. Sunlight spilled across the frozen lake in sheets of white fire. Icicles flashed along porch eaves. Smoke climbed slow and blue from chimneys. Church bells rang once over the town, small and clean in the brittle air. From a distance, Silver Ridge looked like the kind of northern place city people framed on holiday cards and called peaceful. Callan Mercer had lived there long enough to know that peace and prettiness were not the same thing. He drove into town just after 8, his old truck moving carefully over the packed streets. Naomi sat beside him, wrapped in her long blue-gray parka, one hand tucked low beneath the blanket across her lap. In daylight, she looked more composed than she had the night before, but not stronger. Her face was still too pale, her eyes too shadowed. Chestnut-brown hair fell loose around her cheeks despite the low tie she had made with unsteady fingers. She had put herself together because dignity matters most when a person feels it slipping. Callan respected that. He did not comment on it. Vargo rode in the back seat this time, though his head remained between the front seats more often than not, his amber-brown eyes fixed on Naomi with a solemn protectiveness that felt almost human. The shepherd's yellow-black coat had been brushed roughly with Callan's hand before they left. His worn leather collar caught the winter light whenever he moved. "We go in through the back," Callan said. Naomi nodded. "I know." "You don't talk more than necessary." Another nod. It was not that Callan believed silence solved danger. He simply knew that in a small town, danger often rode on ordinary conversations. A woman at a cash register remembering the wrong face, a clerk mentioning something harmless to the wrong customer, a man in a warm coat hearing one useful detail and arranging the rest around it. Elen's clinic sat near the far end of Main Street, attached to a low-brick community building that also housed the pharmacy and 2 county offices. The front entrance faced the road. The back entrance faced the alley and a line of plowed snowbanks. Callan parked behind the building and walked Naomi in through the service door, one hand close enough to catch her if she slipped, though he never touched her unless she needed it. That, too, mattered. After men like Gavin, permission became a kind of medicine. Inside, the clinic smelled faintly of antiseptic, old coffee, and radiator heat. Elen met them in the hallway without a wasted word. Today she wore a light gray turtleneck beneath her dark olive winter medical parka, dark utility pants, and brown waterproof boots still crusted with a little snow at the soles. Her expression was calm, but her eyes moved quickly. Naomi's face, Naomi's gait, the set of Callan's shoulders, the dog. "You came early," Elen said. "You told us to," Callan replied. "That's why I say it." Even Naomi managed the smallest ghost of a smile. Elen took her into the exam room and checked her carefully. Blood pressure, hydration, bruising, abdominal tenderness, fetal heartbeat, signs of early contractions. Naomi answered questions in a low voice, one hand never quite leaving her belly. There was something deeply moving about the way she guarded the child without drama. She did not speak about motherhood sentimentally. She held herself like a woman trying to keep a candle lit in high wind. "The baby's still doing well," Elen said at last. "But stress like this can start problems before they announce themselves. You need rest, steady food, and fewer shocks. Your body cannot keep believing every hour is an emergency." Naomi let out a thin breath. That would be easier if every hour stopped being one. Elen did not argue with her. She closed the chart gently instead. "Then we reduce what we can." For a moment Naomi said nothing. Then her fingers tightened on the edge of the exam table. "I copied some of the files," she said. Callan, leaning against the wall near the door, straightened almost imperceptibly. Elen's face changed only in the eyes. "What kind of files?" "Internal records, transfers, valuations, authorizations, enough to show patterns, maybe not enough to bury anyone by itself." Naomi swallowed. "I didn't keep them at the apartment. I didn't email them. I put them somewhere else." "Where?" Callan asked. Naomi looked at him, then away. "Not yet." He held her gaze anyway, not with pressure, but with steadiness. "You're asking people to put themselves between you and someone dangerous." "I know." "Then eventually," he said, "you'll need to trust one of us." The words landed hard because they were true. Naomi's eyes flashed with shame, then anger at the shame, then tiredness beneath both. "I trusted the wrong person once already," she said. No one in that room could honestly argue with that either. Elen finished the appointment and walked them out by the side corridor, but by then the town had already begun its soft little machinery of noticing. It always amazed Callan how quickly rumor moved in cold places. Maybe because long winters trained people to listen for changes. Across the street from the clinic, the pharmacy had just opened. Tessa Boone stood outside in her apron, shaking snow from a rubber floor mat before dragging it in. Tessa was 26, maybe 27, slim and quick-moving, with light skin, a narrow face, and light brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail beneath a knit cap. She had the bright-eyed energy of a woman who meant no harm, but had not yet learned that curiosity was sometimes a blade with no handle. Her world was still small enough that information felt like weather, something that passed through people, not something that could change their lives. She looked up. Her eyes went first to Callen, because everyone in Silver Ridge noticed when Callan Mercer appeared somewhere at an unusual hour, then to Naomi, then to Vargo. "Oh," Tessa said, with the startled friendliness of someone who believed all surprises wanted conversation. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." Callan gave the kind of nod that usually ended things. It did not end this. Tessa glanced at Naomi's stomach, then back at Naomi's face, and all at once too much understanding and not enough wisdom crossed her expression. "Did you need me to call the pharmacy side? We can have—" "No," Elen said from behind them, her tone smooth but final. "We're handled." Tessa flushed. "Right, sure, I just meant—" "I know what you meant," Elen said, not unkindly. "Go on, honey." Tessa did, but not before looking once more at Naomi with a mixture of sympathy and speculation. It was a small look, the kind people dismissed. Yet Callan had spent enough time in operations to know that small leaks sank bigger things than storms did. They had almost made it back to the truck when Vargo stopped walking. Not stiffly, not in alarm. He simply planted himself beside Naomi and turned his head toward Main Street with complete focus. Callan followed the dog's gaze. A black SUV had just rolled into a space near the bakery. It was not flashy by city standards, but in Silver Ridge it had the sleek, dark finish of money and the confidence of something that expected doors to open. The driver stepped out a second later. Gavin Holt was a handsome man in the way some winter roads were beautiful, precise, cold, and best appreciated from a distance. He was around 41, tall, clean-shaven, fit without heaviness, his dark brown hair carefully styled, and his charcoal wool coat cut to flatter the long lines of his frame. Beneath it, a dark turtleneck showed at the throat, black leather gloves, dark trousers. Everything about him had been chosen to communicate competence without vulgarity. Even his face had that polished restraint people too quickly confuse with trustworthiness. His eyes, from where Callan stood, looked gray in the winter sun. Naomi stopped breathing for one full second. Callan heard it. So did Vargo. The shepherd moved at once, placing himself between Naomi and the sidewalk before Gavin had taken more than 2 steps. Gavin saw the dog, then Naomi, then Callan. What impressed Callan most was not surprise, but recovery. Good liars did not need time to become the version of themselves they performed best. "Naomi," Gavin said, and his voice came out warm enough to fool almost anyone who had not lived under it. "There you are." Naomi's hands had curled into fists beneath her blanket. "I've been worried sick," he continued. Callan said nothing. Townspeople were beginning to notice. A man carrying feed sacks slowed near the hardware store. Two elderly women outside the church steps paused in the act of talking. The bakery door opened, and warm yellow light spilled briefly onto the snow before someone stepped out into it. That someone was Mabel Crow. Mabel owned the bakery and wore age the way some women wore armor. Not gracefully, exactly, but effectively. At 71, she was small and sturdy, with a lined, expressive face, silver-white hair pinned into a low, loose knot, and sharp blue eyes that had watched several decades' worth of respectable nonsense pass across her counter. She wore a warm brown sweater under a dark apron, a cream scarf at her throat, and old leather boots that looked as if they had personally survived every winter Silver Ridge had ever produced. Mabel believed in feeding people properly, judging character accurately, and never confusing politeness with goodness. She took in the scene in one glance and did not smile. Gavin came a little nearer, hands visible, voice still calm. "You had people terrified, Naomi. You vanished. I've been trying to get help for you." Naomi's lips parted, but no words came. That was when Callan understood something useful. Gavin did not need Naomi silent because he feared her screaming. He needed her silent because her fear made his voice sound more reasonable. "She doesn't want help from you," Callan said. Gavin looked at him as if noticing him properly for the first time. "And you are?" "Someone she asked not to leave." The words were plain. They landed harder than a threat would have. Something cool shifted behind Gavin's eyes. Then he smiled the smile again. "I'm glad she found someone, truly. Naomi has been under a great deal of pressure, and pregnancy can make fear spiral into things that feel real." Vargo took one deliberate step forward. He did not bark. He did not show teeth. He simply became a wall. The effect was startling precisely because it was so controlled. Even people who knew nothing about dogs knew what it meant when an animal chose certainty over noise. Gavin stopped. The winter light seemed to harden around the edges of the square. Mabel crossed her arms from where she stood outside the bakery and said into the cold, "Funny thing about dogs. They don't care much for public relations." A few heads turned toward her. Gavin laughed softly, as if indulging a harmless local wit. But the laugh had effort in it now. "Elen," he said, shifting attention, "if Naomi's having some kind of episode, I would appreciate it if the clinic refrained from—" "She's my patient," Elen replied. "You can appreciate distance." Color rose high in Naomi's cheeks, not from warmth, but from humiliation and fury. That, more than anything, seemed to wake her. "I am not having an episode," she said. Her voice shook, but it carried. Gavin's expression gentled in a way that made Callan want to break something expensive. "Naomi, no one's blaming you." The sentence hit her like a slap. It was designed to. Naomi took one step backward instead of forward. Vargo moved with her, keeping the line intact. "I know what you're doing," she said. If Gavin felt the blow, he hid it beautifully. "You're frightened. That's exactly why you need stability." People were watching now in earnest. Silver Ridge was a town that disliked scenes, which meant scenes acquired power simply by existing. Callan could feel the weight of other people's uncertainty gathering around them. The dangerous thing about a man like Gavin was that he looked like the kind of man communities were trained to trust. Clean, controlled, helpful, generous at fundraisers, present at church repairs, easy with handshakes. Monsters, Callan thought, rarely entered through the front door snarling. At last Gavin stepped back. "Fine," he said softly. If this is how you want to do it. He looked at Naomi, and for the first time, the concern fell away just enough for something colder to show beneath. But you need proper care. I hope the people advising you understand how serious that is. Then he returned to the SUV and drove off as cleanly as he had arrived. Only after the vehicle turned the corner did Naomi's knees weaken. Callan caught her elbow before she tipped. Mabel was already crossing the street. Up close, she smelled faintly of cinnamon, flour, and wood smoke, as if baking had entered not just her kitchen, but her skin. "You look half frozen standing there," she said to Naomi, though her voice had gentled. "Come inside for tea before I start resenting all of you." Naomi gave the smallest startled laugh. It sounded rusty, as if laughter had not been taken out and used in some time. Inside the bakery, the windows fogged at the edges from ovens and breath. Warmth wrapped around them. Mabel set tea before Naomi without asking what she took in it, then somehow got it right anyway. For 10 minutes, nothing happened except warmth, sugar, and silence. That was when Elen, standing near the pastry case with her arms folded, finally looked at Callan and said very quietly, "There's something else." He turned. "A psychologist from Duluth called the clinic 3 days ago," she said. "Asked whether we had prior records indicating emotional dysregulation in a pregnant patient named Naomi Reed." Naomi went still. Elen's mouth hardened. "No referral came from us. No one in town requested it, which means somebody was already building a file about her before she disappeared." Outside, the town remained bright and charming beneath the winter sun. Inside, the shape of the danger changed. It was no longer only pursuit, it was preparation. By the time Callan brought Naomi back to the cabin, the light over Silver Ridge had begun to soften from hard white into the pale gold of late afternoon. The town shrank behind them in the rearview mirror, church steeple, bakery awning, frozen lake, all of it still wearing the harmless face it offered strangers. But the road east felt different now. The beauty had not changed. The meaning had. Naomi sat quietly in the passenger seat, both hands around the paper cup of tea Elen had insisted she take for the drive back. The warmth had faded before they reached the lakeshore, but Naomi still held the cup as if it gave her something to do besides shake. Her hazel eyes stayed fixed on the windshield. Once or twice she pressed her lips together the way people do when they are trying not to let humiliation turn into tears. Callan did not tell her she had done well in town. He did not tell her she had been brave. He suspected those words would sound too neat after a man like Gavin had just tried to reshape her reality in front of half a street. So he drove. The truck heater rattled. Vargo sat upright in the back seat, watchful and silent, the yellow-black fur along his chest catching strips of light whenever the road curved. At the cabin, a temporary rhythm formed. Not peace, not yet, but something quieter than panic. Naomi sat near the front window wrapped in a blanket, drinking ginger tea Elen had sent home in a mason jar, and watching the white world outside as if it might at any moment decide whether to spare her. Vargo lay at her feet, one ear always angled toward the road. Callan split wood behind the cabin, each swing of the axe clean and controlled, but his eyes kept sweeping the tree line in the pauses between blows. Some habits did not leave a man when the uniform did. They simply changed scenery. There was something almost painful about how ordinary the afternoon tried to become. The kettle hissed, firewood cracked. A dish was washed. Snow slipped from the low edge of the roof in soft collapses. Naomi asked once where he kept the mugs. Callan pointed without looking up from the table where he was cleaning mud from a pair of chains. She moved carefully now, slower than she used to, he imagined, not just because of the baby, but because fear teaches the body to conserve itself. It was Naomi who broke the silence first. "I used to paint signs," she said, so unexpectedly that Callan looked up. She sat in profile to the window, the winter light making her face look finer, sadder, younger. Her chestnut-brown hair had come partly loose again and brushed the shoulders of her pale blue-gray parka. Without makeup, without whatever polish her old life may have required, she looked more like herself than she probably had in months. "What kind of signs?" he asked. "For shops, cafes, a daycare once." She gave a faint smile that did not last long, but was real while it lived. Window lettering, murals, kids' rooms, small things, not enough to get rich, enough to feel like my hands belonged to me. Callan waited. Naomi drew her thumb along the rim of the mug. "I studied applied art for a while. Not long enough to make my mother feel secure about it. She thought I should find something steadier. Then she got sick, and I found bookkeeping work because insurance was steadier than paint." Her mouth curved again, this time in bitterness. "Funny how life can make you practical right before it makes you miserable." "She died recently?" Callan asked. "1.5 years ago." Naomi's voice thinned, though she kept it level. "Lung cancer. Fast by the end. My father was gone before that, so when Gavin came along, I think I was lonelier than I understood." She did not say more for a moment. The fire shifted. Vargo opened one eye, then closed it again. "He knew how to enter a room without making me feel crowded," she said at last. "That was the first thing. Some men push. Gavin made space. At least in the beginning. He remembered small details. He talked like he had time. After my mother died, that felt like kindness." "And later?" Callan asked. Naomi stared out through the glass at the bright snow. "Later, he started deciding what counted as kindness." The sentence settled between them. Callan knew enough about control to understand the shape of it, not because he had ever practiced it like Gavin did, but because he had spent years studying the ways power moved through fear. Only in war, at least the honest kind, men usually wore their intent more plainly. He turned back to the chains in his hands, but his mind had gone elsewhere, unwillingly. There had been a village once, not even the kind that made headlines. Mud walls, sun-beaten cloth, a road barely fit for trucks. An evacuation window had narrowed faster than expected. Intelligence had shifted. Timing had slipped by minutes, maybe less. When his team arrived where civilians were supposed to be staged, one woman and her unborn child had not made it to transport. Callan had carried her body because somebody had to. He still remembered the weight. Not heavy, that was the problem. A human life reduced to less than his gear. After that, he stopped believing in phrases like "under control." Control was just a prettier word people used before reality embarrassed them. Naomi's presence in his cabin touched that memory without naming it. That was what unsettled him most. A knock came shortly before dusk. Callan rose at once, but Vargo was already on his feet, not barking, just alert. Through the front window stood a woman wrapped in a worn taupe coat, one gloved hand holding a covered plate, the other steadying herself against the porch rail. She was small and slightly stooped, with silver-gray hair pulled into a low, practical knot, and a face lined so deeply it seemed carved by weather and waiting. There was nothing fragile about her exactly, but age had thinned her body into something spare and careful. Her eyes, pale and watchful, belonged to someone who had been disappointed by charm often enough to stop mistaking it for goodness. "Who is that?" Naomi asked softly. Callan looked once, then opened the door. "Mrs. Vale." "Agnes," the older woman corrected, stepping in with the brisk dignity of those who intend not to be fussed over. "And if you call me Mrs. Vale again, I'll assume you think I'm dead already." She handed over the plate. Cornbread, still faintly warm. Agnes Vale was 72 and lived near the eastern lake shore in a narrow old house her husband had built before his heart gave out one winter morning 12 years earlier. Since then she had remained there alone, tending a property too big for one woman, because grief is often more willing to maintain a place than to leave it. She moved cautiously, but not timidly. Her hands were thin and blue-veined, but her gaze remained dry and unsentimental. "Mabel sent me," she said, shrugging out of her coat. "Said there was a young woman here who might know a thing or two about names on papers." Naomi had gone very still. Callan watched that, then stepped aside so Agnes could come fully into the room. When Agnes saw Naomi, something changed in her expression. Not recognition exactly, but the small, hard click of a suspicion finding its shape. "I've seen you before," Agnes said. Naomi nodded slowly. "At North Vale. You came in last fall with a folder and asked to delay signing something until your nephew could read it." Agnes made a dry sound through her nose. "And they did not enjoy that?" "No," Naomi said. They did not. They sat at the table with tea while the daylight thinned outside. Agnes told her story in the plain way old women often tell the worst parts of their lives, as if ornament would only waste time. After her husband died, she had kept the house and lake parcel because leaving it would have felt like betraying the years built there. Then North Vale Horizons began circling the area, first with friendly letters, then with free consultations, then with men in good coats explaining rising values and efficient transitions. Agnes had been asked more than once to sign preliminary review authorizations she did not fully trust. One of them had come on a morning after a new medication left her dizzy. "I may be old," she said, lifting her chin, "but I'm not eager to help someone steal from me with proper formatting." Naomi looked stricken. "Your file had notes on it." Agnes's eyes narrowed. "What kind of notes?" "Language about confusion, isolation, limited support structure." Naomi's voice dropped lower with each word. "They weren't just valuing land. They were valuing how easy people would be to move." For a long moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked in the stove. Outside, the lake held the last of the sky like sheet metal. Then came the rehook, not loud, not theatrical, but the kind of moment that made the room feel briefly touched by something deeper than chance. Agnes had set her gloves beside the plate. Vargo, who had kept a respectful distance from her until then, rose and walked over. He sniffed the gloves once, then twice, then lowered his head, not to the gloves, but to Agnes's knee. The old woman froze. Very slowly she placed one weathered hand on the dog's head. "My husband used to say good dogs know grief faster than clergy do," she murmured. Vargo remained still under her hand, his eyes half-lidded, as if accepting a truth too old to require explanation. Agnes's fingers trembled only once. "I haven't had a living thing lean on me like that in years." The room seemed to soften around the sentence. Naomi turned her face away and wiped quickly under one eye. Callen looked down at the table because sometimes mercy embarrasses people more deeply than cruelty. When Agnes finally withdrew her hand, Naomi asked, "Did they ever send Gavin Holt to your house?" Agnes looked up. "Twice." The answer changed the temperature of the room. "The first time he brought flowers," she said. "The second time he brought concern. Men like that always think concern is the sharpest knife." Naomi sat back heavily, one hand on the side of her belly. "So it wasn't just me?" "No," Agnes said. "It never is." Dark had fully settled by the time Agnes rose to leave. Callan insisted on walking her to her car. Naomi stayed by the fire with Vargo and the empty teacups, her expression no longer merely frightened, but altered by recognition. The evil around her had grown wider, which was terrible. It had also become less isolating, which was not nothing. At the door, Agnes pulled on her gloves and paused. "If you've got proof," she said to Naomi, "proof matters. But do not underestimate what men can do before proof gets its coat on." After she left, silence returned, fuller than before. Naomi stood by the mantel for a long while, staring into the stove. Then, without turning, she said, "I didn't tell you the truth about the key." Callan came in from the porch and shut the door behind him. "I figured." She gave a humorless huff of breath. "I wasn't lying about what it opens, just about why I kept it back." She reached into the inside seam of her parka and drew out the tiny brass key tied with red thread. "I needed to know if you were trying to rescue me or manage me." Callan looked at the key in her hand. "It opens a storage locker at the Old South Tourist Depot," Naomi said. "The place where winter fishing visitors rent little cubbies by the day. Cash only. No ID if the old manager likes your face. I used to sketch there in college because the windows looked out toward the tracks, and the light was good. Gavin never went with me. He thought it was shabby." "What's inside?" Callan asked. "Copies of files, handwritten notes, dates, names, things I started keeping when I realized I might need to prove my own memory back to myself." That, more than anything else she had said, made Callan understand the length of her suffering. He was about to answer when the lights went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Went out. The cabin dropped at once into the red breathing glow of the stove and the thin blue light from the snow outside the windows. Naomi inhaled sharply. Vargo was already on his feet. Callan moved without thought, taking the flashlight from the shelf, checking the back windows, then the front. No headlights, no movement near the porch, no sound but wind. "Stay here," he said. Naomi grabbed the edge of the table but did not argue. Outside, the cold felt even sharper after interior warmth. Callan cut around the side of the cabin toward the breaker box mounted beneath the eave. Snow crunched under his boots. His breath came hard and white. The cover hung open. He lifted the flashlight. The main switch had been thrown by hand. Not storm damage, not overload, not accident. Callan stood very still, the beam of light fixed on the open box, while the woods beyond him said nothing at all. No one had broken a window. No one had kicked in a door. No one had even come close enough to leave a message that could be photographed or taken to a sheriff. This message had been better than that. It said, "I know where she is." When he stepped back inside, Naomi read the answer in his face before he spoke. The key was still in her hand. Vargo stood beside her, ears forward toward the dark beyond the walls. And in the small cabin by the lake, with the stove throwing restless shadows and the winter night pressing close, all three of them understood that the world outside had just moved one step nearer. Morning came early, not because the sun rose faster, but because none of them had truly slept. Callan was already awake when the first gray light began thinning the dark beyond the cabin windows. The fire had burned low. The air held that cold metallic quiet that settles after something has been disturbed in the night. Naomi slept on the couch, one hand curled protectively beneath the blanket over her belly, her breathing shallow but steady. Vargo lay on the floor beside her, not asleep so much as resting between moments of vigilance, his ears flicking at sounds too small for human notice. Callen stood by the window, watching the tree line. The open breaker box had been closed again before he came inside, not to hide it, but because leaving it open felt like surrendering control over something small. Control mattered in pieces, even when it could not be held in full. He turned when Elen stepped out of the back room, pulling her parka over her shoulders. "You're going," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Elen studied him for a moment. In daylight, she looked even more like what she was. 36, capable, composed, with a face that had learned to read trouble without dramatizing it. Her brown hair was tied low again, a few loose strands catching the morning light. "I'll stay with her," she said. "But don't take longer than necessary." Callan nodded. Naomi stirred then, blinking slowly as if returning from somewhere distant. When she saw him near the door, something in her expression sharpened. "You're going to the station," she said. "Yes." She pushed herself upright, wincing slightly as she shifted. "The locker is on the south wall, second row, number 27. The lock sticks sometimes. You have to turn the key halfway, then back, then push." Callen memorized it without writing it down. Naomi hesitated, then reached for the small brass key tied with red thread where it rested on the table. She held it for a moment longer than necessary before handing it over. "It's everything I couldn't carry with me," she said quietly. Callen took it. "I'll bring it back," he said. Naomi shook her head. "Bring back what matters." The words followed him out into the cold. The old tourist station sat at the southern edge of Silver Ridge, where the town gave way to a stretch of unused rail and a parking lot that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. In summer, fishermen used the place for storage and cheap rentals. In winter, it became something else, forgotten, half-used, tolerated rather than maintained. The sky was clear again, bright and merciless. Snow lay in thin, uneven sheets across the cracked asphalt. The station itself was a low rectangular building of faded siding and wide glass windows now filmed with frost. The door creaked when Callen pushed it open, the sound too loud in the stillness. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust, cold metal, and old wood. Vargo's paws clicked softly against the tile floor as he moved ahead, scanning, not restless, just precise. The German shepherd's posture shifted slightly, head lower, ears angled forward, body balanced. Not alarmed. Ready. "Easy," Callen murmured. The storage lockers lined the far wall exactly where Naomi had said. A row of small metal compartments, each with a numbered door and a lock that had seen better years. 27. Callen crouched, inserted the key, turned halfway. It stuck. He reversed, adjusted, then pushed inward as Naomi had instructed. The lock gave with a dull click. For a moment he did not open it. Then he did. Inside sat a small, tightly packed space of things that did not belong to the kind of chaos Naomi had described, but to someone trying to impose order on it. A USB drive wrapped in a strip of cloth. A thick envelope filled with photocopied documents. A worn leather notebook, edges softened from handling, and beneath them, almost tucked out of sight, a small bundle of personal items. An ultrasound photo folded carefully, a receipt from a clinic visit, a torn slip of paper with a handwritten appointment time. Callen lifted the ultrasound first. The image was grainy, abstract to anyone who had not learned how to read it. But the date in the corner was clear. Naomi had kept this close enough to carry, far enough to protect. He placed it back exactly where it had been. The envelope came next. Property records, authorization forms, valuation reports. Names repeated across different files, some signatures clean and confident, others uneven, as if written by hands, unsure of what they were signing. Patterns. Callan did not need a legal education to see them. The notebook was heavier than it looked. He opened it. Naomi's handwriting was tight, controlled, almost too careful at first, then gradually more urgent. Dates, names, locations, notes about conversations, small details that would not matter alone, but began to form something larger when placed together. And then, tucked into the back pocket, a small recording device. Callan turned it over in his hand. He hesitated only a moment before pressing play. Static, then voices. Gavin's voice came through first, calm, measured, stripped of performance in the way people sound when they believe no one outside the room will hear them. "She needs to be stabilized," Gavin said. "Emotionally, medically, whatever term makes it cleaner." Another voice responded, male, older, cautious. "You're talking about the mother of your child." "I'm talking about a variable," Gavin replied. "And variables complicate timing. Once the baby is here, everything becomes slower, messier. Courts start listening to feelings instead of paperwork." Silence. Then Gavin again, softer, colder. "It's easier before that." The recording ended. For a moment, the station seemed to close in around the sound that was no longer playing. Callan slipped the device into his pocket. Vargo, who had been standing near the entrance, shifted suddenly. Not a bark, a change. The dog's body angled toward the rear exit. Callan followed his gaze. Footsteps, not rushed, not careless, measured. The re-hook came in that quiet recognition, the kind that did not need surprise to create tension. Callan understood in that instant that whoever had cut the power at the cabin had not been guessing. They had been narrowing. The rear door opened. 2 men stepped inside. Neither of them wore uniforms. Both of them wore the same kind of neutral, durable clothing that tried not to draw attention. Dark jackets, heavy boots, gloves. One was taller, broad across the shoulders, with a thick neck, and a face that had been broken once and reset without much concern for symmetry. The other was leaner, quicker-looking, with sharp eyes that moved too often. They did not introduce themselves. "Place is closed," the taller one said. Callan stood slowly, not aggressive, not passive. "So open it," he replied. The leaner man's gaze dropped briefly to the open locker, then to Callan's hands. "You found what you needed?" he asked. Callan did not answer. That was answer enough. The taller man took one step forward. "We can take that off your hands," he said. "Save you the trouble of carrying it around." Vargo moved then, not toward them, across. A subtle shift that forced the leaner man to adjust his footing just slightly to avoid stepping into the dog's path. That was all Callan needed. He moved at once, not to attack, but to break the line. A pivot, a shove. The leaner man stumbled half a step back as Vargo's presence disrupted his balance more than expected. The taller man reached out, but Callan had already turned, grabbing the envelope and notebook, tucking them tight. "Not worth it," the leaner man muttered. "Not today," the taller one agreed. They did not chase. That was what made it worse. This was not desperation, it was containment. Callan and Vargo left the station without running. Behind them, The door closed with the same quiet finality it had opened with. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun had shifted west, turning the snow into a softer, bluer light. Naomi was waiting by the table, standing now despite Elen's earlier instructions. Her face searched Callan's before he had even fully stepped inside. He set the items down carefully. Naomi did not reach for them immediately. Instead, she looked at his hands. "You got it," she said. "Yes." She exhaled slowly, then picked up the notebook. Her fingers moved over the cover like someone reacquainting herself with a piece of her own memory. "I started this when I found out I was pregnant," she said. Elen leaned against the counter, arms folded. "Before you ran?" Naomi nodded. "I thought I was imagining things at first, that maybe I was just overwhelmed." She gave a small, humorless smile. "That's what he kept telling me, so I started writing things down. Conversations, dates, how I felt before and after certain meetings." She flipped through the pages. "At some point," she said, "it stopped being about proving him wrong. It became about proving to myself that I wasn't disappearing." Her hand rested over her belly. "This," she added softly, "made me stop waiting." Callan watched her. The story was no longer just about land. It was about ownership of memory, of choice, of identity. He reached into his pocket and placed the recording device on the table. Naomi stared at it. "Is that—" "Yes." She did not ask to hear it. She did not need to. After a long moment, Callan straightened. "We can't keep you here," he said. Naomi's head snapped up. "I'm not sending you back," he added immediately. "But this is past hiding. They're already testing how close they can get." Elen nodded slowly. "He's right." Naomi's shoulders tightened. "Then what do we do?" Callan looked toward the window, where the tree line stood still and indifferent. "We make this legal," he said. "And who do we trust with that?" Elen asked. Callan did not hesitate. "Helen Bristow." By late afternoon, the light over the lake had gone the color of cold brass. The day had begun with an illusion of stillness. Snow along the fence posts glittered. The pines stood under a pale sky with the stern patience of witnesses. The cabin looked almost peaceful from outside, smoke lifting from the chimney, the porch swept clean, Vargo's tracks marking a steady circuit through the yard. But inside, peace had already begun to fracture. Naomi had been uneasy since morning. At first it was only a tightening across her abdomen, brief, low, enough to make her pause with a hand against the edge of the table and breathe through it. Elen noticed immediately. She did not dramatize it. She only watched closer, checked Naomi again, and reminded her to sit, drink, breathe, rest. Yet the air in the cabin had shifted. The body knows when it is being asked to carry too much fear. Callan spent the afternoon making calls from the kitchen while pretending he was not listening for every change in Naomi's breathing from the other room. He had already set aside copies of the most important evidence, some documents, Naomi's notes, the recording device, because if anything happened to one set, another needed to live. The originals remained hidden in a lockbox beneath the floor panel under his workbench. The copies sat in a manila envelope on the table beside his truck keys. He called Helen Bristow first. Helen answered on the second ring with the clipped steadiness of a woman who had spent 4 decades hearing human greed arrive, disguised as urgency. At 64, Helen carried herself with an upright precision that made even silence sound formal. Her silver-gray bob never seemed out of place. Her glasses, thin-framed and practical, sat midway down the bridge of her nose when she was reading, and high when she was displeased. She was an estate attorney and longtime notary who had handled wills, land disputes, and family collapses for half the county. She knew where the dead left their truth and where the living tried to bury it. When Callan explained the situation, Helen did not gasp, did not speculate, did not waste breath on outrage. "You are now past the stage of private concern," she said. "You are in documented coercion territory. From this point forward, record times, visitors, calls, every detail. Do not let anyone remove Naomi under the language of care, unless I hear the legal basis with my own ears." Callan leaned one hand against the counter, looking through the doorway toward Naomi, who sat wrapped in a blanket near the stove. "I'm trying to get this in front of someone official." "You need two kinds of official," Helen replied. "Law and witness. If the first is delayed, secure the second." Then she gave him a number and told him to call Owen Pierce directly, not dispatch. Deputy Owen Pierce picked up after 4 rings, sounding breathless and irritated, which meant he had probably been outside. Owen was 33, fit, straight-backed, and still young enough to think integrity ought to be enough if carried honestly. He had a trustworthy open face, short brown hair, and the kind of eyes that still revealed what he felt before his training could cover it. That was part of why people either liked him immediately or distrusted him on principle. He had not yet learned how to make peace with systems that moved slower than harm. Callan gave him the short version. Owen was silent longer than Helen had been. Then, "You're telling me a pregnant woman may be under coercive control, you've got evidence tied to land fraud, and now somebody's escalating?" "That's what I'm telling you. I'm on shift until midnight. I'll get out there if I can." "If?" Owen exhaled. "We've got a jackknifed feed truck on the east approach and only 2 road units covering weather calls. I'm not saying no. I'm saying don't assume I can teleport." Callan respected the honesty more than reassurance. "Then move as fast as real life lets you," he said. By the time he ended the call, Naomi was gripping the arm of the chair with whitening fingers. Elen crossed to her immediately. Another contraction. Not full labor yet, not certainly, but not nothing. Elen crouched in front of her, one hand on Naomi's knee. "Look at me. Is it sharper than before?" Naomi nodded through clenched breath. "How far apart?" "I don't know." "That's fine. We'll start tracking." Vargo rose from his place by the hearth and came to Naomi's side. The shepherd stood close without crowding, ears tipped forward, amber-brown eyes fixed on her face. He seemed to understand that the danger now had more than one shape. Agnes had been at the cabin less than an hour earlier, dropping off a bag of groceries Mabel sent and insisting she did not need escorting home. Once Naomi's contractions grew more regular, Elen made the choice for everyone and called Mabel to get Agnes out of the area. Mabel arrived in her old pickup within 20 minutes, wrapped in her brown sweater and beige scarf, her small, sturdy body carrying the energy of a woman who had long ago accepted that morality often required fuel money. She took one look at Naomi, one look at Callan's face, and said only, "I'll get Agnes home and keep my mouth shut in public and open in the right places." That was as close to a vow as Mabel ever gave. The rehook came just after sunset. Naomi had finally managed to sip some broth. Elen was timing contractions with her watch. Callan was at the window when Naomi's phone, dead since the night she was found and only recently charged enough to power on, lit up on the table. No number, no name, just a message. Naomi saw it before Callan could stop her from reading. "You cannot bring that child into the world without our permission." For 1 second the room made no sound at all. Then Naomi's face emptied. Not panic first, something worse, recognition. Elen snatched up the phone. "Don't answer." "I wasn't going to," Naomi whispered. Callan stepped closer. "Has he ever sent anything like this before?" "No." Her hand went to her stomach. "No, he never put it in writing." That, more than the words themselves, told Callan how serious the shift had become. Men like Gavin preferred deniability. If the wall between control and threat was beginning to crack, it meant pressure had outrun caution. Elen looked at the phone screen again, jaw tight. "He wants her scared enough to make bad decisions. He wants her feeling claimed," Naomi said. Callan took the phone from Elen and photographed the message with his own. Then he wrote down the exact time in a notebook Helen had told him to keep. Small acts, necessary acts, the kind that turned chaos into record. Outside, darkness gathered fast, and with it came the next problem. A local plow driver called Owen and then Callan to say a small utility truck had gone dead across the main road out of the Lake District. Not impossible in winter, not even rare, but the timing stank of arrangement. "They can clear it," Owen said over the phone, voice chopped by engine noise. "But it's taking longer than it should." "How much longer?" "I don't know yet." Callan stared into the black beyond the porch light. "That's exactly the point. From then on, the cabin ceased being a refuge and became a perimeter." Callan checked every lock, brought in the tools from the porch, loaded extra firewood, and moved his truck to angle across part of the drive so no one could roll straight up to the front steps. Elen set out towels, water, blankets, and medical supplies in the back room, in case Naomi progressed too quickly to move. Vargo made constant silent passes between the front door, the kitchen, and Naomi's chair, as if measuring the pulse of the house. The first knock came at 8:17 p.m. Not pounding, not frantic. 3 controlled raps. Callan looked through the narrow side pane before opening anything. A dark SUV. 2 men in neutral coats, and with them a woman holding a black medical bag. The woman stood slightly apart from the men, uneasy in ways she likely believed she was hiding well. She was in her 40s, maybe 43, with fair skin, short blonde hair pinned back under a knit cap, and the strained, competent look of someone used to clinics, not confrontations. Her body was slight, her winter coat expensive but practical, her expression a tense compromise between professional duty and private alarm. Callan opened the inner door, but kept the storm door closed. "Can I help you?" The taller of the 2 men inclined his head. "Private Maternal Support Service. We're here to transport Ms. Reed for monitoring." Elen was beside Callan before the sentence ended. "On whose orders?" The blonde woman cleared her throat. "My name is Dana Kerr. I'm a registered nurse contracted through North Star Maternal Recovery. I was told there was a distressed patient in possible early labor who required a calmer setting." Naomi made a sound behind them, not loud, but full of revulsion. Elen stepped forward. "Then you were told wrong. There is no transfer authorization, no physician request, and no consent." Dana Kerr's face changed slightly at the word consent, enough for Callan to notice she had not been given the full truth. "I was informed the father had authority to intervene," Dana said carefully. "The father," Elen replied, "does not outrank the patient." One of the men shifted. Vargo appeared beside Callan without a command, his shoulders lifted, body rigid now, not with frenzy but with judgment. He fixed his gaze on the nearest man and did not blink. The man stopped moving. Callan kept his hand on the doorframe. "You can leave." Dana hesitated. "If she's in labor, she may need transport." She'll get it from the county when I say so, Elen said. Not from a private contractor sent by a man trying to establish control. Something embarrassed and angry crossed Dana's face. She looked toward Naomi then, really looked, perhaps for the first time. Saw the fear. Saw the truth she had not been paid enough to ask about. I wasn't told this, she said quietly. No, Naomi replied from behind them, voice shaking but audible. You were told I was unstable. Dana's mouth tightened. She lowered her eyes for a beat, then lifted them to the men. I'm not taking this case. The shorter man swore under his breath, and then headlights appeared again beyond the SUV. A second vehicle. Gavin stepped out. He wore a dark charcoal coat, black gloves, and the expression of a man who had perfected calm so thoroughly it had become a weapon. Snowlight sharpened the angles of his handsome face. He looked composed enough to be photographed beside a charity check. Too composed for a night like this. He approached the porch as though arriving at a business meeting delayed by weather. Naomi, he said gently, this has gone far enough. Something in her snapped into hardness then. She pushed herself to her feet, despite Elen's protest, one hand braced on the back of the chair, the other beneath the curve of her belly. No, she said, it hasn't gone far enough. Not for you. Gavin paused. Elen stayed between them, but Naomi stepped to one side so her words would reach him without translation. You took my phone, she said, breath catching between phrases as another contraction built. You changed appointments. You called doctors I never asked to see. You started making me sound sick before I even ran. Gavin's voice remained maddeningly soft. You were frightened. You still are. These people are feeding that. You tried to turn me into paperwork. The sentence hit harder than Callan expected. Gavin's eyes cooled. I tried to create stability for a child who deserves it. Naomi laughed once, a raw, unbelieving sound. You mean control? He took one step nearer. Vargo moved at once. The shepherd did not lunge. He did not bark. He simply crossed the threshold space between porch and door and placed himself squarely there, a living refusal. His body became absolute, old scar at the ear, amber eyes like lit stone, chest lifted, paws planted, the kind of creature that made human lies look suddenly very small. No one moved. The next contraction hit Naomi hard enough that she gasped and doubled over. Elen was at her side instantly. Sit down, now. Naomi clutched Elen's arm. I can't. Then warm fluid darkened the floorboards beneath her boots. For one impossible second, the room and porch and yard seemed to freeze around the sight of it. Her water had broken. Everything accelerated. Elen's voice cut through the chaos first. Call 911 again, now! She needs transport. Callan already had his phone out. Outside, Gavin spoke for the first time without full control. This is exactly why she should have been moved earlier. Get off my porch, Callan said, and there was enough in his voice now to make even the two hired men step back. Sirens did not come quickly, but they came. Owen arrived first in a county unit, tires spraying snow, face set hard with effort and fury. He came out fast, winter deputy jacket half-zipped, duty belt low on his hips, light eyes sharp in the porch glow. "What do we have?" he asked. "A blocked road, an attempted private transfer, a woman in active labor, and a man who needs to stop speaking," Elen said. Owen looked once at Gavin, then at the nurse, then at Naomi on the chair, gripping the blanket around her knees. "Sir," he said to Gavin. "You need to step away from this residence." Gavin opened his mouth. Owen raised a hand. "No, you don't get to explain it prettier." Behind him, a second vehicle pulled in. Sheriff June Halbrook, broad-shouldered beneath her tan-brown winter sheriff jacket, dark hair streaked with gray and tied back low. June had the face of a woman who had spent 25 years watching people mistake confidence for innocence. She climbed the steps, took in the scene in one pass, and made a decision the way seasoned lawmen do, without performance. "No private transport," she said. "Not tonight." Gavin had not been defeated. Callan knew that. Men like him rarely fell in a single scene. But he had lost the one thing he came for: control of the room. The ambulance finally arrived minutes later, its lights throwing violent red across the snow. Paramedics took Naomi carefully, Elen going with them because Naomi would accept her hands where she would fight strangers. Owen stayed close, making sure Gavin remained on the wrong side of authority for once. Dana Kerr stood apart, stricken, her bag still unopened. As they loaded Naomi in, she caught Callan's sleeve. Her face was wet with sweat and fear and pain, but her eyes were clear. "Don't let him rewrite this," she whispered. "I won't," Callan said. Then the doors shut. The ambulance pulled away into the white-black road, siren rising over the frozen lake. Callan got into his truck. Vargo jumped into the passenger seat and sat upright, body still, gaze fixed ahead. Under the hard northern stars, with ice-bright night on every side, Callan followed the ambulance through the snow like a man driving after a promise he had not known he was waiting to make. Dawn came to Silver Ridge like a hand laid gently over a fevered brow. The night had not ended all at once. It had thinned. The blackness outside the county hospital windows had first turned iron gray, then pearl, then a pale northern gold that slipped quietly across the parking lot, over the mounds of plowed snow, over the roofs of cars standing in patient rows beneath the cold. It was the kind of morning that made the world look forgiven without ever pretending it had not first been wounded. Callan Mercer had not slept. He stood at the end of a hospital corridor with a paper cup of coffee long gone cold in his hand, and Vargo lying against the wall beside his boots. The German Shepherd's broad head rested on his paws, but the dog was not truly asleep. Now and then one ear flicked toward the labor room doors. Now and then his amber-brown eyes opened to check that Callan was still there. The old brown leather collar at his throat looked strangely domestic under fluorescent hospital light, yet nothing about Vargo had become ordinary. Even in stillness, he carried the quiet gravity of a creature who had already chosen his side and had no intention of leaving it. Callan looked like a man who had spent the night holding himself upright by discipline alone. His old olive-gray tactical shirt was hidden now beneath a borrowed dark jacket from the truck, but the rest of him remained unmistakably himself, lean, compact, square-jawed, clean-shaven, hair cut short in that almost military way, light skin roughened by cold and fatigue, gray-blue eyes more shadowed than usual. He had carried men out of violence before. He had waited for gunfire, helicopters, bad news, and body counts. Yet none of those nights had taught him what to do with the sound of a woman laboring behind a closed door, while hope and terror shared the same air. Elen Shaw had gone in with Naomi hours earlier, and had not come out except once to ask for a warmer blanket, and once to say, "She's still fighting well." That phrase remained with him, still fighting well, as if survival had become Naomi Reed's native language. Deputy Owen Pierce had stayed too, though not in one place. He moved between the nurses' station, the administrative office, and the security desk with the taut focus of a man trying to do a job cleanly inside a situation that refused to stay simple. Owen's winter deputy uniform jacket was unzipped now, his brown shirt wrinkled at the shoulders, his hair flattened on one side from too many hours indoors. He was 33 and still young enough to let frustration show plainly when systems moved slower than danger. But he had done what he could through the night, filed the initial protection report, logged the threatening message, documented the attempted private transfer, and made sure hospital staff knew Naomi was not to be released into anyone's custody without her direct consent. That mattered, not enough to undo the harm already done. Enough to stop its next cleanly dressed version. Sheriff June Holbrook had remained until almost 3 a.m. before leaving only because there were other roads, other emergencies, and because she trusted Owen to hold the line here. June was the kind of woman towns like Silver Ridge needed more often than they deserved. Sturdy, unsentimental, with dark hair threaded by gray, and a face that had lost patience years ago with men who mistook smoothness for innocence. Before she left, she had looked directly at Callen and said, "He won't be able to walk in here and claim this as family business. Not anymore." Then she had gone back into the winter before dawn. When the cry finally came, it was smaller than Callen had expected. Not weak, just new, a thin, fierce sound, impossibly bright in the hush of the corridor. For 1 second, Callen did not move. Neither did Owen. Even Vargo lifted his head sharply, ears forward, as if some ancient instinct in him recognized that a new life had just declared itself in the world. Then Callen's hand tightened around the cold paper cup until it bent. The labor room door opened a minute later, and Elen stepped out with her mask lowered and exhaustion written honestly across her face. Her medium brown hair had slipped loose around her temples. Her light gray turtleneck was creased. There was sweat at her throat despite the chill of the corridor. Yet her eyes, those steady gray-green eyes that had held through every turn of this ordeal, were warm in a way Callen had not seen before. "She's here," Elen said. Callen swallowed once. It took him longer than it should have to ask the next question. "And Naomi?" Elen smiled then, small and tired and real. "Alive, furious, protective. In other words, Naomi." He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere much older than the night. "And the baby?" "Small, but good. They'll keep an eye on her because she came early, but she's breathing strong." For a moment, Callen could only nod. His hands that had once stayed steady while dragging wounded men across rough ground, trembled very slightly now. Elen noticed. She was kind enough not to mention it. "Come in," she said. Quietly. Inside, the room had that strange, exhausted holiness certain hospital rooms hold after a birth. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sweat, warmed blankets, and the human rawness of pain survived. Naomi lay propped against pillows, damp hair clinging at the temples, skin washed pale with fatigue, face hollowed and luminous at once. She looked younger and older than she had in the cabin by the lake, less guarded, more battle-worn. Her arms held a bundled infant with the total concentration of someone who had not merely been given a child, but had carried one through fire. When Naomi looked up and saw Callen, something softened in her expression, not dependence, not rescue, but recognition. "She made it," Naomi whispered. Callen stepped closer to the bed. The baby was tiny, red-faced, wrapped so tightly she looked almost unreal, like something woven from breath and stubbornness. One small fist had escaped the blanket and opened slowly against Naomi's gown, as if testing the world, before fully committing to it. "She was angry the whole way out," Elen said from behind him, a trace of dry humor returning now that danger had loosened its grip by an inch. "I take that as a good sign." Naomi's mouth trembled upward. "She gets that from me." There, in that room, Callan felt the past reach toward him and fail to take hold. The woman he had once not reached in time, the child he had not helped save, the village, the dust, the failure that had lived for years like a sealed room inside him, all of it was still true. But it was no longer the only truth. There was this now. Naomi breathing, the baby alive, dawn at the window, the world refusing, just this once, to end the way it had before. "What's her name?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked down at the child. "Liora," she said. "Liora Reed." The name lingered in the room, light, not in a grand, dramatic sense, in the simple northern way, the kind that comes after long cold and lets you see where to place your feet. Owen came to the doorway but did not enter fully. He removed his hat out of instinct more than etiquette. His trustworthy face, too open to hide much, had gone unexpectedly tender at the sight of Naomi and the child. "I've got an update," he said softly. "Whenever you're ready." Naomi looked at him. "Now." He gave a short nod. Helen was up before the courthouse staff and had documents moving before sunrise. She filed for an immediate protective hold regarding attempted coercive removal and requested emergency review of any pre-existing medical or psychological claims made against you. Sheriff Halbrook logged the road obstruction and the private transport attempt. Dana Kerr, he glanced at Elen, gave a statement that she was contacted under false pretenses and never received lawful transfer authorization. Naomi closed her eyes briefly, absorbing it. Owen continued. "We're not at the finish line, but Gavin Holt can't walk in here and call himself your decision-maker. Not today. Maybe not ever, if this holds the way Helen thinks it will." "And the evidence?" Callan asked. "Secured." Owen's voice steadied a little as he said it, because process was the one place he knew how to fight without doubting himself. "Your copies, Naomi's notes, the recording, the message, the contact log, statements from Elen, Mabel, Agnes. Helen also flagged prior property reviews she already thought smelled wrong. The county attorney's office won't like being embarrassed by this, which means they may actually move faster." Naomi gave a tired laugh that cracked halfway through. "That's the most hopeful thing anyone's said to me in months." The rehook came later that afternoon, after a few hours of sleep and silence and the soft machinery of nurses checking vitals. Vargo had been allowed briefly into a quiet family room down the hall, while Naomi rested, mostly because one of the older nurses had taken one look at him and said, "I've seen calmer dogs in delivery wards than most husbands." But when Elen brought him near the room's threshold, and Naomi asked for the baby to be held where the dog could see her, something happened that made everyone stop. Liora had been fussing in the fretful, pre-cry way newborns do when the world is too bright and too large. Elen shifted the blanket. Naomi tried to soothe her. The baby's tiny face pinched tighter. Then Vargo exhaled. Not a bark, not a whine, just one deep, steady breath through his nose, the sound low and warm and certain. Liora fell still. Her little fists relaxed, her face unwrinkled by degrees. The room, full of hospital sounds and exhaustion and the residue of fear, seemed to draw in around that moment and hold it carefully. Naomi started crying then, not from distress, but from that particular helpless gratitude that comes when the heart can no longer contain both relief and wonder at the same time. "No one," she said through tears and laughter, "is going to tell me dogs don't know things." "No decent person has ever tried," Elen replied. Callan stood near the doorway and said nothing, because sometimes language only made holy moments smaller. By evening, the legal shape of the story had begun to harden. Gavin did not vanish from Silver Ridge. Men like him rarely did. But he had lost his clean possession of the narrative. The recording did not prove every crime on its own. Naomi's notebook was not a courtroom victory by itself. Agnes's account of predatory paperwork, Mabel's witness, Dana Kerr's statement, Elen's medical observations, the threatening message, the blocked road, the attempted removal, Helen's prior suspicions regarding land reviews, none of it was a single blow. But together it formed something more dangerous than scandal, a pattern, and patterns, once named, are much harder to bury than incidents. Naomi did not become weak with safety. That may have been the most important part. Over the next days, as Leora remained under observation and Naomi recovered strength, she made choices. She signed no document she had not read. She refused every attempt to phrase her fear as confusion. She kept her own surname for the baby without apology. Reed, not because the name carried power, but because it carried truth. She accepted help, but not ownership. That distinction changed the whole shape of her healing. Callan visited, then stood back when needed. He did not suddenly become a savior polished by a happy ending. He remained what he had always been at his best, a man who had finally refused to look away when fate placed a life in front of him and asked something costly. Elen became more than a doctor in those days. She was the bridge between medical fact and moral clarity, between what could be proved and what could still be protected. Mabel brought bread and gossip sharpened into useful information. Agnes came once with a knitted cap no larger than a hand and said only, "Every child needs something made by someone who hopes for them." Helen moved through paperwork like a winter blade, clean and merciless where it counted. Owen stayed within the limits of law, which turned out to be its own kind of courage. And then winter shifted, not all at once. Northern winters never give up gracefully. But by the third week, the snow along the lake edge had begun to sink and darken. Water showed beneath ice in thin silver seams. The light stayed longer each evening. Naomi came to the cabin on one of those early spring afternoons, Leora bundled against her chest. The air still held cold, but it had softened. The yard smelled faintly of wet earth beneath old snow. Callan stood on the porch steps in his worn combat shirt and old work boots, one hand resting on the rail as if he were not entirely sure how to receive this moment. Sunlight fell across his shoulders and turned the weathered planes of his face gentler than usual. Vargo stepped out first. He did not rush. He walked slowly across the thawing ground, head lifted, then lowered it as he came near Naomi and the child, as if approaching something sacred required its own pace. Leora, who had been making small restless noises beneath the blanket, went quiet at the sound of the dog's calm breathing. Naomi looked down, then up at Callan, and tears filled her eyes before she smiled. No one called it a miracle. People in places like Silver Ridge did not use large words unless forced. But they all knew this much. If Vargo had not turned his head that day on the white road, if Callan had not stopped the truck, if Elen had not believed, if Owen had not held the line, if Helen had not made paper tell the truth for once, if Mabel and Agnes had not chosen decency over convenience, Then a woman and her child might have been erased without blood, without headlines, without anything louder than a few tidy documents and a man's practiced voice. Instead, light had returned to the right place. And sometimes, Callan thought as he watched Naomi step toward the cabin with Leora in her arms and Vargo at her side, that was all grace needed to be. Not thunder, not spectacle, only a faithful dog, a stopped truck, and the stubborn refusal of a few human hearts to let the world go cold where it most wanted warmth. Sometimes the miracles God sends into our lives do not arrive in grand and shining ways. Sometimes they come tired, trembling, and close to breaking. Sometimes they come in the form of a frightened mother, a newborn child, a faithful dog, or one moment when a person chooses courage instead of comfort. This story reminds us that evil does not always appear loud or obvious. Sometimes it comes dressed in calm words, polished manners, and the promise of safety. But truth has a way of surviving. And when even one person refuses to look away, when even one heart stays faithful, God can begin to restore what fear tried to steal. Naomi's story teaches us that strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is telling the truth while trembling. Callan's story teaches us that a wounded heart can still become a shelter for someone else. And Vargo reminds us that God sometimes uses the purest loyalty in creation to guide human lives back toward mercy, protection, and hope. In our daily lives, many people around us may be carrying silent pain. Some are afraid. Some are exhausted. Some are one act of kindness away from giving up, or one act of kindness away from believing again. We may not all be called to do something dramatic, but all of us will be given chances to stand on the side of compassion, justice, and truth. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or tell us about a moment when God brought light into a dark season of your life. And if you believe stories of faith, healing, and courage still matter, please subscribe to the channel so more hearts can be encouraged. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your spirit, heal your hidden wounds, and send peace into every place in your life that still feels cold, lonely, or afraid.